Hi, welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about why your GRC tool is probably underperforming. So I'm going to talk about why people implement tools and how they end up getting less than they expected in terms of business value delivered. So the reality is the tool exists, but governance still feels messy. So you've got your tool live, you've got your risks in there, you've got your issues in there, but you still feel like you're not quite getting the value expected when you were in the procurement process. So everything that was promised doesn't feel like it's been delivered, especially with regard to the audit process. So gathering evidence is still quite painful, and you feel like a bit shortchanged, like you haven't got everything you need. So security works because security work becomes hard to manage manually. So when you've got a number of risks, controls, you've got many audits that you're working towards. So let's say you're certified to many standards, and then you have many questionnaires coming in from your clients, or that you need to send out eventually again. And then evidence has become a very, very unwieldy beast that you're struggling to keep up with, on top of the audit related activities as well. And then ownership is unclear because the tool hasn't provided you with a process. I'm going to break down the reasons that typically cause this. So starting off with the problem. So the tool is expected to fix unclear governance. So I always say garbage in, garbage out, and by that I mean that if the processes you had in place before you brought in a tool were not really established, or people didn't really understand why they were doing things or how to do things, then when you bring in a tool, it's going to be the same thing, but it might even be worse. So let's say, give an example of having a lack of processes, but no tools. So if you've got a lack of processes, people do things in an inconsistent manner. They have personal workarounds for getting things done. Whereas when you have a tool, you have the personal workarounds, plus you have the admin of having to input things through a tool. So people are doing two sets of work rather than just that one established process that filters through an automated system. So, a lot of GRC tools underperform because the business has not defined what counts as a risk, who owns controls, what evidence is required, how reviews happens, and what leadership needs to see. So, if you don't have a clear view of how you define a risk in your organization, so a lot of organizations, as I've previously mentioned in another video, they go between issues and risk. So they have both issues, control failures, all of that linked into one risk register as opposed to keeping things separate. In terms of evidence, you might have, let's say, generic frameworks. So let's say ISO 27001 or NCSE CAF. You might have a very generic description of what the evidence needs to be, but you haven't broken it down by business area. So, for example, for a control whereby you need to have evidence from two areas of the business, you might have it listed as one. So you need to have clarity around what you're trying to collect in terms of evidence before you even get to the tool. The tool is almost like a enhancer. So for example, most tools you'll put in a clause to say this is the evidence you expect, this is the owner, and this is the cadence with which you need to collect it. And then from there on, the tool begins sending out the automated reminders. It gives you a platform for saving the evidence, but it's still not going to do the work for you in terms of the pre-work, understanding what it is you need to collect and how often you need to collect it. So the think of a GRC tool as like a waiter in a restaurant. So the kitchen needs to cook, and then the GRC tool delivers the food, like the waiter delivers the food to the customer, being like, let's say, leadership or users. If there isn't any food to deliver, no matter how efficient the waiter is, there's going to be no value delivered because it hasn't been created yet. So prior to getting a tool, if you've already got the tool, fine. Just try and like manually sketch out almost like your customer journey. So from, let's say, for the evidence collection process, what evidence do you need, how to define the evidence, and then walk across the entire process. And then as you go through that process, and generally over time, you can look at the process and decide that actually this is an opportunity to automate. This is something that's repeated. So for example, chasers, that's something that's really good, that GRC tools are really good for, chasing evidence, or what the process is if you receive evidence and it's not of standard, or you need to clarify whatever it is. That just have the end-to-end process sketched out independent of the tools, because tools, there's variety in the way different tools do things, and that's to almost account for the fact that businesses have different ways of doing things. But for your organization, determine the best way, or the best customer journey for what you're trying to achieve, or every single piece of information you need to retrieve, and make sure you have that mapped out and understood. The tool becomes an expensive spreadsheet. So a lot of people bring in a tool, but they don't necessarily mature their processes. To get the full benefit from a GRC tool, you need to have, like I mentioned in the previous point, you need to have an understanding of every single process. So not just what you're currently doing, but your future aspiration. So let's say you would like to have a risk register that indicates areas that need to be escalated, or have like processes for reviewing risk register entries that have been in the spreadsheet for X amount of time. Think of everything you'd like to do in terms of aspiration, and then find out how you can automate. Because the main benefit between a spreadsheet, like a simple Excel or Google sheet, and a GRC tool is the level of logic that you're able to put in the background. So whether that is automated workflows, time-based workflows, there's a lot you can do in terms of getting more value, flagging and automatically sending reports for when they're overdue actions owned by a specific person, looping in their line manager. All those sorts of time-saving automations is what differentiates a simple spreadsheet from a full-on GRC tool. And that's not to say that you must have a GRC tool, because it's always quality over complication. That as long as you're getting the same results, it's just going to take you a little bit longer most of the time. So if you're not able to get a GRC tool, it's still not a problem, but the principles are the same. Have a process, have an understanding of the customer journey for each of the different processes, and then highlight opportunities to automate. Desired outcome. So a good GRC tool should make governance easier to run. So in an ideal world, because you have a GRC tool, you'll have a bunch of automated reports that you're able to draw upon each month. So let's say you have a number of different governance forums for risk and security, etc. You should have a set of reports that are being automatically created based on what you need to discuss in each of those meetings. So a common one is top risks. So helping the business understand what matters. So what are their priorities for the month, week, fortnight, so whatever cadence you have these meetings. Having a clear visual, so whether it's heat maps, or I like table form, so you can have like a table that has your different risks, so you can have a little bit of information, so risk ID, the title, the scoring, if there's been any movement up or down, so has it worsened, has it improved. It just gives like a snapshot to management for them to understand, this is what we're dealing with right now, this is where we need your help. Ownership, assigning accountability clearly. So leading on from that, leadership should have a look at something that is, let's say, a risk that is performing really badly, and know who's responsible. Do they need support? Is there any resourcing needed? Or just having an understanding of the areas of the business that have more problems or more risks versus less. Again, just to assign, it's not to do with blame, but it's just to get further detail in terms of why things are like that. And then also understanding if you need extra resources. Controls. So tracking performance and gaps. So let's say control effectiveness exercises. If you can see that 40% of the control effectiveness exercises have failed. Causation, understanding why that is. Evidence. So collecting and reusing evidence. So here I would like to note that I try to keep evidence collection ongoing throughout the whole cycle, as opposed to having an audit coming up in 3 months and preparing for that. So creating a environment where you're always audit ready, as opposed to chasing the audit. Because one, in terms of culture, it instills a culture of constantly assessing controls. And then secondary to that, you're not in like panic mode when a audit comes in. You're already organized, you've got everything you need, and you've already established the process. People know how to discuss evidence, people know how to present evidence, because they've been doing it all year, as opposed to rushing a couple of times a year for the different audits you might have. And then leadership. Most importantly, the so what question. Leadership are looking at anything you present to them with a so what lens. So, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? The information you present from the GRC tool should answer that question very easily. So your GRC tool is not the governance strategy. Over the years, I've seen GRC tools pushed by vendors as like a solution to everything. But the point we always miss is that we need to have processes underneath that, culture underneath that, to make sure that when the tool does come in, we've got the foundations already. So using that same example of a restaurant, we are only going to be able to present meals that have been prepared in the kitchen. The kitchen hasn't prepared it or hasn't been prepared well. The waiter can't change anything about that. They're just delivering the message quickly or delivering the food quickly. So the first, I'd say this is probably the biggest question, the biggest issue in most cases. So the risk taxonomy is unclear. So you haven't defined what belongs where. So using that same example of like the risk register having issues, control failings, findings, having a mix of everything as opposed to clearly defined risk. So a risk being something that could happen or and harm the business. On this, I think sometimes people are coming from different environments and have different ways of referring to risk. So in this case, it might be worthwhile doing a training exercise where you almost create a version of risk management, cyber risk management education for the organization, and then make sure that people are clear on what you mean when you say a risk, an issue, an action, and finding. It's a good exercise for bringing everyone up to speed and making sure everyone has the same understanding before you then move on. Because when it comes to loading items into the risk register or getting accurate risk descriptions, it's probably the best way to do it. Okay, next issue, something that's already happening. Action, something someone needs to do. Finding, formal gap identified in review. So for things like actions, it's worthwhile integrating with any ticketing systems you have. That can be another way of tracking things. If your GRC tool doesn't do it, or if it already exists somewhere, rather than duplicating it into the risk register, you can just have that linked in, so that you don't have to basically do things twice. Number 2, ownership is unclear. So the tool has names but not real accountability. It's not enough for someone to know that they own a risk. They need to know what their responsibility is as well. So even if it means having, again, an exercise where you communicate expectations, get their perspective and understand what they believe they need to be doing, just to make sure there's nothing missing in what you both understand. So then business risk, the owned accountable business leader. So sometimes the person that is ultimately responsible is different from the person that might be doing the more technical configuration. So that could be like IT or engineering, or the evidence collection, the person that is responsible for the actual control itself, and then risk acceptance, the person that has enough seniority to accept a risk as a business lead. So again, before you get into the tool and assign, I don't know, like a risk to someone, have a conversation. It's never acceptable to just assign a risk to someone and hope that they're going to step up. Always have that conversation to make sure they understand what is expected of them. And then it should also be backed by policy. So it should be outlined in policy, the type of person that is needed to own a risk, a technical control, evidence, whatever it is. Controls are not operationalized. So controls exist in a tool but not in the business. So for example, you can list a control in the GRC tool, but if it hasn't been personalized for the business, so I'll give an example of ISO 27001. If there's a control in there that has outlined a control or evidence expectation, but you haven't actually customized it for what that means for your organization, so where it exists, how many controls or different areas need to be evidenced in respect to that as well, then it's not enough for someone to have that assigned to them and it's clearly understood. So control meaning, what does this mean here? So giving that context of, okay, if it's in IT, it means this. If it's in production, it means this. If it's in test, it means this. Giving that level of detail for what the expectation is in each of those, and that lends quite nicely into the evidence portion. Because if you've got, let's say you have one control listed in the GRC tool, but then you're expecting 3 pieces of evidence, it's not the most logical layout in terms of making sure that you've collected everything you need. If you have, let's say, one control from 3 areas, you'd expect to have 3 almost sub-controls so that you're collecting a piece of evidence for each of those. Evidence, what proves it works? So what are you expecting by way of evidence? So if you're saying multi-factor authentication is in place in, let's say, Slack, what evidence are you expecting for that? So writing a description and saying you expect to see a page showing the configuration setting within within Slack, and then maybe a times, maybe including a timestamp or something like that. So getting very detailed. So if people move on from the organization, you have an established way of collecting evidence for that area. So that helps not only you as the security auditor, but it also helps anyone that might take on that role because they have clear expectations in terms of how the evidence needs to look. They don't have to guess. And then you should also have the history of how it's looked in the past so that they can use that as a way to understand. And then frequency, how often is it reviewed? So define how often you should be collecting that evidence. So again, you can align that to the standards that you work with. So ISO, Cyber Essentials, etc. You can decide once a year, twice a year. It again is up to you, but define that in there so the expectation is clear. People know what to expect. Evidence is not designed for reuse. So this is a pet peeve of mine. I feel like most organizations are aspiring to certify to a standard of some sort, if not immediately, eventually. So why not get into the habit of creating evidence that is almost standard agnostic? So rather than making things very, very bespoke, make it detailed enough that each audit can use the same piece of evidence, as opposed to chasing an audit, making sure you're ready for just one, but then when the next one comes, you have to almost start your efforts all over again. Create a system that provides repeatable outcomes. So if you're audited by ISO 27001 in January, and then you have an audit like an external audit from another company in May, you should in theory be able to use the same system of evidence gathering because you've created a system that works for everything. It might feel a bit overkill, but I think long term, especially when it comes to your workforce, it's a lot less stressful for them to align to one standard or one method of collecting, as opposed to having to chop and change depending on who's in town. So required evidence, what needs to be uploaded? It should be so clear. It should be so clear what is required based on what has been listed in the GRC tool and what they're able to review from previous audits. It should be a system, almost like a library that they can go into and look at for reference if they're not sure. Evidence owner, who provides it? So when I say who provides it, who's responsible for supplying the evidence, but then also in terms of redundancy, making sure that someone else is aware of how to provide that evidence. So that's almost where the control library comes in, because if you can show them an example and say, this is how we collected it last time, it's very easy for them to align to that. Frequency, how often is it refreshed? A lot of these tools work on a cycle, so depending on the cadence that you set, it will remind you to provide evidence it could be every week, every day, an established frequency. And then normally all you need to do is click upload and then supply the evidence, and then it needs to be approved by the security team. Linked requirements, which audits, clients or controls use it. This is really helpful because it makes it easy for the evidence collector or provider, to understand the importance and why things are being done. But again, if you adopt the vendor or provider agnostic approach, then this shouldn't really be a problem. Workflows do not match real work. So if a workflow does not align with what you actually do in the business, it's going to create a lot of invisible work, and that invisible work can cause the team to basically avoid engaging with the process altogether. So for example, wrong approver, request gets stuck. I'd say wrong approver or not enough approvers. So let's say there's an approver for access control, but it's one person that's allowed to approve it rather than a group of people. That means that, let's say the person is out of the business on holiday, on sick leave, on whatever, it might mean that things get stuck. So again, people don't feel encouraged to engage with that process. Unrealistic timeline. So if things take too long and it's something that's business critical, like let's say it's client facing work, people are more likely to kind of ask for escalations or exceptions or something like that and not engage with the process again. Too many steps. So if the team finds that it's being more of a hindrance than a help, again, they're less likely to engage with the process. They're probably going to try and find a way around it. And no context. So let's say they receive a request, they're not used to it, they don't understand it, and they're busy, they're probably going to ignore it. So make sure that the request has all the information they need, it's clear what they need to do in order to satisfy the request. Reason 6. Reporting is designed for the tool. So there are dashboards in there, but leadership still can't make decisions. So the dashboard exists, but it doesn't provide enough information for leadership to know what to do next. So for example, a weak dashboard, it just tells you the number of risks, the number of controls. It doesn't give you anything that helps aid decision making. So, for example, a more useful view would be top risks and risk movement. So, since the last, like, let's say the last report or in the last month, this is what's happened. Blocked treatments and accepted risks. Those are quite useful information. So, blocked treatments tell leadership what they need to escalate. And then lastly, decisions needed this month. So that's action on their part. What do they need to do? The tool is not in operating rhythm. So nobody runs governance from the tool. So it's not synced up with the reporting that happens within the business. So for example, weekly, it doesn't meet the weekly need for action, follow up, and blockers. So again, we don't have a view of that. Monthly, we don't understand the risk movement and overdue items. Quarterly, we don't have the control checks and evidence updates. And then annually, audit readiness and roadmap refresh. So I say all this to say, when you're bringing in a tool, there might be some default settings in there, but you always need to look at the tool and look at your existing processes and make sure they marry up together. So the tool needs to mirror what you're doing in your organization already. Even if you end up changing it over time, it's still more important to start off aligning exactly so that it's familiar to the organization. And then if you decide to change or tweak things later, you can make that change slowly. You don't want to change both the internal processes and the way of doing things. That's too much change at once. And always, as always, make sure that you're asking for feedback to understand where there might be people dropping off of your process, or there might be things that are preventing people from doing their jobs. So I'm going to give some examples of good setups. So starting off with the risk register. So if this is an underperforming setup, so the risks are imported from a spreadsheet with vague titles, inconsistent ratings, unclear owners, and no treatment decisions. And then the better setup is that risks are categorized, they're owned, they're linked to controls. Every single risk has an assigned treatment action. It's reviewed monthly and reported to leadership when there are decisions that are needed. So depending on the type of risk or the rating of the risk, it's reported to leadership. The control library. So controls are copied from the framework in a very generic way. It's not mapped to any real processes or evidence, so it's not personalized at all. And then the better way to do it is making sure each control has a business meaning, an owner, an evidence requirement, testing frequency, and linked risks. Evidence management. So evidence is uploaded when audits start, compared to evidence being collected during normal control operation and then reused for audits. So rather than chasing audits, you have a baseline expectation of collecting evidence on a regular basis. And then for reporting, dashboards show counts, but it doesn't explain what leadership should do. A better way of doing this is for reports to show movement, blockers, accepted risk, overdue treatments, and decisions required. So in that setup, leadership are clear on what they need to do next. The so what question has been answered. So objection one that people normally have is that, but the tool has workflows. That's true, but it only works when the process reflects reality. So if people are already in the habit of doing things a certain way, it's going to be easy to transition to the tool. The tool is just enhancing what's already been done. If the process isn't clear and established ahead of bringing in a tool, then you're going to have the same problem. So for example, if the process underneath them is clear, if owners, tasks, timelines, and escalation routes are clear already, then the tool will help you. Otherwise, it's just going to be a hindrance. People are going to do two sets of work or ignore the tool altogether. But we need automation. This is very valid. Automation is useful, but only when the manual process makes sense. So as you go over time, you should be seeking opportunities to automate. Automation is a good thing, generally. But if the underlying process is not good, you're just adding speed to a problem that doesn't work. So again, going back to that restaurant analogy, if a waiter is going faster, but they're not necessarily taking the most efficient route, you're increasing the chances of them, like tripping up or something, or just not delivering how you'd expect. So if you automate unclear requests, poor evidence, vague ownership, and weak reporting, you're scaling the mess. So I'll give another example. If we have automated chases sent to managers, but you've listed the wrong owner, you're going to be sending the wrong message to the wrong person repeatedly, and they're not going to be able to resolve it because it's not owned by them, as an example. So you're just going to irritate them and then discourage them from using the tool in the future because they've already got like a bad taste in their mouth about it. Objection free, this is a very common one. So we already paid for the tool, which is very valid. You know, you go through all these funding requests to get the tool in, and then you get the tool and it's not delivering as you expect. But in that case, interrogate the actual operating model. So have a look at what you've got in place already, where you need to design processes, where you need to improve processes, and then start the cultural change exercise of moving people into the tool. And then gather a lot of feedback. So start off with a small group of people, understand where there might be misalignment between the processes in the tool and the processes you follow in reality, and then go from there. The goal is for people to see the benefit of the tool and then decide they can't live without it almost. So what to fix before blaming the tool? First of all, taxonomy. So how people talk about risks, issues, actions, findings, gaps and exceptions. Accountability, making sure that the risk and control owner listed for each is actually accurate and valid. So this should loop in with the GRC process. And then control design, are controls mapped to real processes? Have you customized the actual controls as opposed to just sending the generic descriptions? Evidence readiness, have you defined what evidence is required before the audits start? Usability, is it easy for people to automate their workflows within the tool because it matches reality? And then leadership value, the report showed decisions and not just data. Is it usable straight away? So before you blame the tool, fix the operating model. 9 times out of 10, there are things in the operating model that don't make it conducive for people to adopt the tool and to get the most out of the tool. So if you need to clean up your foundations before the tool can perform, book a security readiness audit to review your GRC setup. So your risk register, your evidence, your controls, ownership, and priority gaps. So scan the QR code and book in with me. Thank you so much for watching.